Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Facebook Live session. This evening, we're reading in Beyond Resistance, Chapter 3. I'm Lynn, and I'm with Kim, and we're both glad that you joined us. So Chapter 3 of Beyond Resisting, the subtitle is Grieving, Believing, Perceiving. And it opens with a quote by William Shakespeare. "Now God be praised. To that believing souls gives light in darkness, comfort in despair." Churches aren't just called to die, they are also called to believe in resurrection and hope. I am deeply indebted to David Rue for this title and for much of the content of this chapter. David is a brilliant man and devoted senior pastor at Plymouth UCC in Des Moines, Iowa. I had the distinct honor of attending an event with him in Chicago, during which time we got to share some drinks and some deep conversation. I had known him and admired him for some time, but those days deepened my respect and appreciation for him. I would also discover his deep and abiding love for the church. It was April of 2012, and we were attending our annual Church of Christ, United Church of Christ convocation. Each year, in the early spring or late winter, national and conference leaders, seminary presidents, and board chairs are called together to address relevant matters regarding the life and future of our denomination. There were two things about the 2012 gathering that should be noted in setting this context. The first is that the Collegium of Officers had announced that they were going to unveil their strategies for living out the long-term goals for the denomination. The second was that, with so much at stake, tall steeple pastors, those who serve in large membership churches, were also invited. That's why David was there. His church in Des Moines is one of the largest in the denomination. In the hours following the presentation by the Collegium of their strategies for our future growth and vitality, I found myself in a room with David and about 20 or 30 others. The presentation had created quite a buzz, and people everywhere wanted an opportunity to talk about what we had heard. It was in that group that David shared with us what he had come to see as the most important work of the church in this time. When he finished, I was deeply moved. His words struck me immediately as profound and meaningful. I asked his permission to use them, knowing that I would have the opportunity as a representative of the wider church to speak in many settings where the words would be both appropriate and important. I crafted my presentation later that month to my conference annual meeting delegates around those insights. A few months after this, I was invited to one of my churches and sat and watched them play a tape of that presentation to their entire church. That's how moved they were by them. That's a testimony to how powerful these insights are to the work of the church in our time. David believes that the church now has three critical tasks: grieving, believing, and perceiving. I will do my best in this chapter to get at exactly what I heard David say that afternoon in Chicago. Grieving. I don't remember when I first heard someone talk about the church living in a time of diminishment or through a time of diminishing resources. I do remember thinking that it was an apt way of describing this time. I also remember spending one of my many nights on the road sharing a hotel room with my dear friend Mike Denton, a Pacific Northwest Conference minister. It was shortly after the collapse of the market, late 2008 or perhaps early 2009. As we always do at the end of our long days together, we were using the quiet time together in the room before we fell asleep, talking about a variety of things. And one of those things was the financial constraints we were all beginning to feel. We noted that many leaders in the church were taking a sort of batten down the hatches, ride out the storm, and when things settled down, take a corrective measure attitude toward the downturn in the economy. Mike then said something that I haven't forgotten and that struck me as pure wisdom. He said, "John, this could be the new normal." The new normal. This turn of phrase has stuck with me. In other words, the resources lost this time around may not be coming back. Strategic thinking about how to get them back may have to give way to strategic thinking about how to be the church with less. What does it mean to be the church in a time of diminishing resources? We are all struggling with this, and as good leaders, we are doing everything we can to remind the church that our vitality depends on our ability to be good stewards of the resources we have for the sake of the mission for which we were birthed. Let there be no doubt that there have been, are, and will be for some time to come losses to sustain. I will talk about some of those, but before we get there, let's also admit up front that most of those losses come with the experience of a real and at times profound grief. And so it is that with the new normal in this time of diminishing resources, the first task of the church is to grieve. This is important. This is very important. We live in the context of a culture that doesn't deal well with grief. I believe that is a byproduct of living in a world of rampant and unchecked consumerism. We are conditioned to anesthetize pain and grief and to invest in a panacea of market products that promise relief, but which in reality only mask our underlying pain. That's another subject for another time. What I mean to suggest here is that we have been conditioned to either deny, repress, or medicate away our pain and grief. To do so in this time of diminishment when the church is going to sustain heavy losses would be unhealthy. A collective call to grieve can easily be met with fear and skepticism. It can be resisted both because of that condition we have inherited in our culture to repress grief and by those who are unwilling or unable to accept that the church is living into a new normal and who believe we will soon and somewhat miraculously, I would argue, return to our halcyon days of sanctuaries filled to the brim and offering plates overflowing with riches. As bearers of the light, however, and as disciples of Christ, we are reminded that we don't grieve as others who have no hope. We know that weeping may last for the night, but joy comes in the morning. It is okay to talk about this grief. It is imperative that we invite our leaders into a time of appropriate grief, knowing that grief will not be the last word spoken by the church. I'm going to pause here and acknowledge that at this point, I have been writing mostly about the church in decline, diminishment, and pain. The writing has produced my own need to process grief. I can well imagine that something like this can be happening to the reader as well. I will continue through this chapter to write about that diminishment. Here's the thing. I am not sure we can adequately and properly grieve unless we name what it is that our eyes are seeing, our hearts are feeling, and our ears are hearing. There is profound loss all around us, and some of that loss is terribly hard for us to take. Collectively, the sense of loss leaves some among us not only experiencing real pain and grief, but also wondering how the church can survive it and whether or not our lifetime commitment to it has been in vain. I am talking about these losses with raw honesty. I admit freely to the grief I experience along the way. I do not grieve, however, as others who have no hope. I see with new eyes what the Spirit is doing in this time, and the call I feel to write about all of this is not a call to talk about what is falling apart, but what is coming. In the end, this is not a word of despair, but of deep and profound hope because of what I believe is emerging on the horizon. Hang in with me, dear reader. Some of this loss I have experienced in deep personal ways. When I came on staff here in the Southwest Conference, we had some very talented, very dedicated men and women working for us. It took me a while to wrap my head around our finances, especially given that I had arrived in late spring of 2008, about 9 months before the market turned. It would take almost another 2 years to process how deeply that market turn would impact our budget and to accept that the money lost was probably not coming back. At the same time this was happening, the board of the Southwest Conference, with the help of some very gifted men and women who would form our financial advisory task force, made a covenant promise to present a balanced budget to our annual meeting delegates. We were able to do that by 2010. I will never forget what I now characterize as one of the most painful phone calls I have ever participated in. It was October of 2009, and we knew that we had made the commitment to present a balanced budget. Annual meeting would be in the spring of 2010. Throughout the year of 2009, we were hearing from churches who were telling us they could not complete their pledges to us. Tales of elderly members whose income was dependent on money drawn from their investments, of wage earners being laid off or downsized out of income, of homes being foreclosed on, were shared with us by pastors telling us why they weren't going to meet their budget and therefore were cutting their pledge to us. Our budget was soundly built on those pledges from our churches and was passed with every reasonable expectation that we would live within it. By October, we knew we couldn't. We had to make some hard choices. One option was that we would not fulfill our covenant promise of balancing our budget. Who could argue that given the circumstances, we did anything short of our best? Who would hold it against us if, in fact, under these circumstances, we failed on our first attempt to balance our budget? There were some on the phone who argued we would be forgiven and that we should just ride this out. For others, though, a promise to our churches was not something we would treat lightly. We quickly gave ourselves over to the task of cutting what we could. The cuts were deep and painful. We lost our incredibly gifted and much-loved communication director. We dropped the position of youth and outdoor ministry coordinator. Trips were canceled. Promises were made by the remaining staff to work fewer hours, which only meant that they worked the same hours but didn't charge the conference for them. The pain of that October 2009 phone call with my financial advisory team is something I still feel. It didn't end there. I had to follow up that phone call with meetings from our board, asking them to approve the cuts that we were recommending. I then had to meet with the respective staff members, some of whom were told that they were losing their jobs. I had to stand before a delegation of representatives from all our churches and report these losses. Acknowledging the diminishment was one source of grief. Losing the talent was another, but nothing compared to the grief of saying goodbye to people and losing the relationships that we had built to keep them over the years. In May of 2010, I found myself working with 5 churches in my conference who reported to their pastors that they were cutting their salaries. For 2 of those 5, the news was worse. It wasn't just that they were cutting salaries, they were eliminating the position of pastor altogether. 2 of the remaining pastors were able to deal with the cuts, though it wasn't easy. The other pastor would work for a little over 1.5 years with the church to figure out how to care for her family with a salary that had been cut in half, a mortgage she was upside down in and couldn't get out of, meaning she couldn't think about moving and looking for another call, and how to meet the needs of the church in working fewer hours. One of those 5 churches not only dismissed the pastor, they shut down all operations. First Congregational United Church of Christ in Tucson had once been a strong, vital, relevant church. The closing of the church sent ripples of fear and grief throughout the Southwest Conference. While the service of closure was a beautiful testimony to the church's ability to regard its past with dignity and to engender hope in the midst of profound loss, There is no doubt that real, deep, and abiding pain was palpable in that sanctuary. When I visit one of their sister churches now, I step into the narthex and see the stained glass window that hung in the entrance of First Church. I feel that sense of loss all over again. These losses are painful, to be sure. For me, though, the most painful work I do today is with clergy. I don't know that I can capture all that they are experiencing in and through this time, but I will try. It is important for the church to own what is happening to clergy. I don't mean to suggest that these dynamics I describe are universal. They are not felt by all clergy everywhere, but my experience is that they are far from uncommon. The first sense of loss that many clergy feel is simply a loss of job security. One of my great joys as a conference minister is working with search committees. I spend a lot of time with them during the period of transition from resigning pastor to interim pastor to newly called pastor. When I first started, I would include in my orientation with a search committee a review of their salary packages. I would explain to them that their profiles had to serve as a marketing tool for the church in what was a very competitive market. Part of the market strategy would not just be talking about what set their church apart, but stretching themselves enough so that their salary and benefits package would appeal to a prospective candidate. It was, as I told them, a pastor's market. I would explain that the church was retiring more pastors than they were ordaining, and had been for some time. I would add that many of the clergy being ordained were second career people who would serve the church not for 40 to 50 years, but for 15 to 20. Given these dynamics, there were more churches looking for pastors than there were pastors available. Pastors had choices and were being smart with them. All of that changed in 2009. All of a sudden, churches that had been stretched a bit to cover the expenses of a full-time pastor were finding it harder and harder to do that. Healthcare alone for a pastor and her family now approaches almost $20,000. As church members were losing jobs and income and church budgets were shrinking fast, more and more churches found that for the first time, they were faced with the prospect of not being able to pay their pastor. I noted that with almost every search committee with whom I worked, there was a conversation in the time of transition about how to cut the budget pastoral staff. If they were a large church with multiple pastoral staff positions, they had to use the interim time to talk about how the staff would be reconfigured in the time of transition. If they were a smaller church with a solo pastor, they talked about how to continue with less than a full-time pastor. 5 years ago, pastors were almost guaranteed a call when their profile circulated, but today it is not uncommon for very talented, very experienced pastors to be in a search for more than 2 years. I learned that in January of 2009, 125 pastors filed papers with the Pensions Board to retire and draw income from their pension. Only 25 of them actually went on to retire. Many of them had lost over half of their collected pension resources in the last quarter. Now, pastors aren't retiring nearly as quickly as they thought they might. They are delaying it for as long as they can, meaning that pulpits that in previous years would be open aren't just yet. Where 5 years ago, I was telling search committees to be smart about how they competed for the pastors who were out there, today I have to talk to clergy about how to be willing to accept much less than what they had grown accustomed to in the past. Today, I counsel all of our seminarians to think seriously about how they are going to earn an income while living out their vocation to the church. I advise them that they should not take for granted that their income will come from the church. Every 2 years, all conference staffs from across our denomination gather for a week at what used to be called our search and call training. It is now called AM 21, Authorizing Ministry for the 21st Century, but it is still a week-long training to keep us up to date on the dynamics of staffing churches through their time of transition. In December of 2012, we gathered in New Orleans for the training. I attended a workshop called Are we Deceiving Our Members in Discernment? The entire discussion centered around whether this denomination was deceiving seminarians by asking them to go deep in debt without the promise of real income on the other side of ordination. It was, to say the least, a very lively conversation. I cannot imagine having that conversation even 2 years prior. I now advise clergy not even think about looking for another church if they are in one that is paying them a living wage with benefits. There is an emerging sense of fear and anxiety experienced by the men and women who have given their lives in service to the church. They work endless hours, modest incomes. Until very recently, they have been reasonably hopeful that if they invested years in training after acquiring a unique set of skills that would serve them and the church well, they would always be able to provide for their families. It is getting harder and harder for many of our pastors to look years down the road and have that assurance. Many of our clergy are at an age when finding another source of comparable income is unlikely, given their narrow focus on developing skill sets unique to the church. Some feel trapped. Some are living painfully with and through repeated cuts in budgets. This can mean frozen salaries without even cost of living raises in most years, deep cuts to their salaries and benefits packages, or in the most extreme cases, the painful admission that the church just can't pay them anything anymore and are cutting the position of pastor. Some with whom I've counseled are seriously contemplating filing for bankruptcy. 2 generations ago, the church noticed that after giving a lifetime in service to the church, many pastors were ending their ministry without having had any income set aside for retirement. Mostly low-wage earners serving in small churches in rural settings, these pastors faced 20 years or more of life left to live with no promise of steady income and very little savings. Knowing that the church owed them more than this, the United Church of Christ established the Christmas Fund. Every year, every church in the denomination took up an offering to help these men and women. Today, the church faces a crisis of a very different kind. How is it going to face the crisis of pastors in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who lose their income from the church and are not able to compete in a job market where even those who have been trained for and have experience in that market outside the church aren't getting hired? Clergy everywhere are experiencing in very personal ways what this time of diminishment means. The grief and anxiety that clergy experience aren't entirely about loss of income. It isn't just about facing an uncertain financial future for both their churches and their families. The source of their grief is much deeper than that. I don't know that I can fully capture this, but it has a lot to do with feeling like a failure. I want to be clear. No pastor I know is a failure. With very few exceptions, these are men and women of the highest quality and caliber. They've acted with deep conviction out of a strong sense of call. They are agents for change, for transformation, and for the common good. They do noble work daily, and very few notice. They make tremendous sacrifices to do what they do, and rarely do I hear them complain about any of it. There is great joy in ministry, and the rewards are offered for it are not calculated merely by whatever financial compensation we receive. The joy comes in other ways. I remember after I did my first funeral, a moment for which I felt unprepared. The widow came back to church 3 weeks after her husband was buried. She met me outside my office, took my face in her hands, and with tears in her eyes said, "I could never have gotten through this without you." I remember walking down a hospital corridor and hearing the screams of a woman dying of a vicious cancer. When I walked into the room and she saw me, she suppressed the screams. I knew I wouldn't stay long because I could see how much it was costing her to do that. I asked her if she would like to spend a moment in prayer, and she nodded. I took her hand, closed my eyes for a quiet moment to center myself, and before I could say a word, I heard her voice. Dear God, please hold our pastor in your tender care and mercy. He means so much to us and is always there when we need him. Give him strength and let him know how much we love him. Amen. To be engaged in ministry is to be called to be present at some of the most meaningful human experiences and to witness God's grace in the midst of them. Over a lifetime of ministry, those experiences come to far outweigh whatever challenges might be sprinkled in during those years. As a judicatory officer of the church, I often had the opportunity to sit and reflect with clergy who are coming to the end of their ministry. To hear them talk with pride, with joy, and with satisfaction about what their years in ministry have meant to them is a privilege I have come to cherish deeply. Lately, though, I am hearing a very different refrain from these men and women. They have spent their latter years watching the churches they serve go into serious decline. This is not a universal experience. I can't say this is true of everyone, but so many pastors, good pastors, qualified pastors, who for years have honed their craft with great care and attention, are experiencing the frustration of now putting those skills to use, but to no avail. Meeting after meeting of their boards are consumed with repeated refrains about budget deficits, membership losses, and failed Sunday schools and youth programs. One of the standards by which we judge our tenure in ministry is whether or not we can say that when we leave, the church is in better shape than when we got there. This is getting harder and harder for so many of us to say, in spite of our best efforts. Clergy now face retirement and wonder what will be left behind them when they leave. Clergy look at their church's shrinking budgets and realize that but for their salaries, the church would be operating in the black. This is emerging in this context, a frustration that comes from so much effort and so much skill being brought to bear with so little to show for it. There is emerging in this context a growing sense of despair that we cannot stop it. There is emerging in this context a collective wonderment about the failure on the part of so many. There's emerging in this context a sense of among the retired clergy that they were wise to get out while they could. There is emerging in this context a collective sense of loss, and with that, a palpable sense of very real grief. There is so much sadness in this. I see skilled, dedicated, passionate women and men working tirelessly, creatively, energetically, relentlessly, and feeling like there is so little to show for it. Despite all of their best efforts, budgets continue to shrink and membership rolls continue to decline. They worry now about their ability to provide for their family. Many feel like they have failed the church, and for some of them, too many really, their churches are more than happy to lay the blame at their feet. It is heartbreaking. I am persuaded by David Rue's wisdom. The church will be invited in these days to grieve deeply. That is not to say that we won't at the same time find plenty to celebrate. We will. That is also not to say that grief will be the end of our work together. It will not be. The church is experiencing real and profound loss. Church closings, staff cuts, program cuts, untenable futures in once healthy and vital congregations, the absence in many settings of children and youth, clergy wondering from where their next call, if not the next paycheck, is going to come. There is much to grieve. We are called upon to own it. We are called upon to name it. We are called upon to endure it. We are called upon to experience it, but not as others do who have no hope. There is hope. The next subtitle is Believing, which brings me to what David Rue sees as the church's second task, believing. Because so much is changing, whether we like it or not, it is now incumbent on the leadership of the church to think long and hard about what we believe. What are our non-negotiables? With so much on the table, including some very sacred cows, are there core values, accepted practices, or fundamental beliefs that if these change, we cease to be? What losses, once sustained, signal the end? These are important questions. It's not the first time the church has faced this prospect of radical change. There have been critical moments in the life of the church when new circumstances, new information, new dynamics have forced the question of change. It is very important to adopt a relationship toward the new. For those who have been fed by current patterns, practices, and policies, decisions must be made about how to relate to what is emerging. If you opt for change, choosing what gets tossed aside and what gets held onto is critical. In her book, The Great Emergence, How Christianity is Changing and Why, Phyllis Tickle refers to this as the church's great rummage sale. When a household decides to have a rummage sale, they don't open the doors of their home to complete strangers and invite them to make an offer on anything they find in the house. Instead, they carefully, painstakingly evaluate which of their treasured possessions is no longer serve the needs of the family. Often with some reluctance, those items are singled out and either sold or given away. There is never any question, though, that some items remain. If, as Phyllis suggests, the church is going through its 500-year rummage sale, then leaders in the church are now called upon to make important and wise decisions about what stays and what goes. Some of this may well be done one church at a time, but not all of it. One church might get rid of their organ or their pews. One might even sell their property. That's different than the church collectively debating the divinity of Jesus, the Trinity, the ordination of LGBT folk, and the need for and role of denominations. Think about the early Jesus movement. Jesus was himself a Jew intent on reform. For his disciples, Jews themselves, he was an advocate and impetus for change. A quick read through Acts and some of Paul's letters reminds us that the first generation church was having their own rummage sale. At the center of this reform movement, known early on as the Way, was a fierce and open debate about circumcision, keep it or not. Paul understood that this was larger than just a question of circumcision. At stake was this emerging movement's relationship to the law. His letter to the Galatians was a vitriolic, angry letter. In it, Paul bares his teeth. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? The only thing I want to learn from you is this. Did you receive the Spirit by doing the works of the law or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, from his 3rd chapter. Phyllis' metaphor may be a bit colloquial, but it works. In the rummage sale held by that first generation, there were those who wanted to throw out both circumcision and the law as a means of acquiring right relationship with the Creator. James thought differently. When he learned that Peter baptized a Gentile before circumcising him in Acts 10, James immediately assembled a council in Jerusalem. With the weight of his office and authority, James compelled Peter to come before the arbiters of orthodoxy and defend himself, Acts 11. Peter's words and the influence of Paul on the early church affected a significant change in the early church. This shift differentiated them from other Jewish sects that did not accept those changes. Circumcision became one of the items discarded by the early church in its rummage sale. Phyllis Tickle observes that these rummage sales happen approximately every 500 years, which is why the church is going through this upheaval now. Like that first generation church, there are circumstances forcing a shift in the church as we know it. Like that first generation of disciples, the church as we know it is going to have to live through open debate about what changes can and will be accepted and what changes simply cannot be made. Be aware that every time a decision like this is made, there is the potential for a division of the body. Some will buy into the change. Others will live on with their firm conviction that the circumstances warrant an even stronger adherence to what grounds us. There are going to be those whose orientation to the new will be resistance at all costs. There are going to be those whose orientation to the new will be acceptance. Either way, a call to be very clear about what you believe is essential. Knowing through the time of change what is so important that if it is altered, we cease to be is an essential task of the church. Knowing what must be passed on through the sea of change that is coming is important. I have been doing an exercise with churches for the better part of the last decade. I ask them what their non-negotiables are. As you face your future, what can change and what can't? Being prepared ahead of time for this will ground a church through the winds of change that are blowing. It is fascinating to watch them go through this exercise. There is intense debate along the way about what can go and what can't. Learning that there are deep emotional attachments to some things that others feel should go into the rummage sale makes for some very interesting conversation. There are distinctions to be made between those precious things that we would grieve the loss of and those things that we absolutely cannot exist without. Many of us in the church today are going to face a time of choosing between the one kind and the other. By what criteria will we be prepared to make these decisions? Place yourself in Europe 500 years ago. The entire continent was awash not only with change, but also with the kinds of decisions that often came with life or death consequences. In the rummage sale that was the Reformation, individuals, congregations, towns, cities, and nations faced choice with very real consequences. In the decades preceding the Reformation, a monk in England by the name of John Wycliffe translated the Bible into English. For the Orthodox Church, this was not a non-negotiable. After his death, the church declared him a heretic and had his body exhumed and burned. One of his disciples, Jan Hus, had to make a similar decision. Like Wycliffe, he was a monk who, in Prague, began teaching about the new way to be the church that including translating the Bible into vernacular. When he did just that, he was burned at the stake. This went on throughout the entire European continent. Princes fought wars over commitments to the old way or the new way. Individual leaders, both lay and clergy, throughout the continent brought congregations with them, one way or the other. Over the next 2 centuries, the Reformation would take hold, but not without a lot of bloodshed. I don't foresee executions and burnings at this time around, but the same moment is going to confront many of us. How much of what is going to change can we tolerate before we say enough? And what lines will we draw that direct us to one side or the other? Some of us have already faced these moments. Will we ordain somebody who hasn't completed seminary? Will we accept as authentic baptisms that are being performed by those with no authorization from the church? Will we ordain a candidate who says she doesn't believe Jesus is the Son of God? Will we ordain openly LGBTQ men and women? Can we allow a church to elect a non-baptized practicing Jew who is not a member of their church to serve as the president of their congregation? Can we accept membership of our church can we accept into membership Can we accept into membership of our church someone who has not been baptized and doesn't want to be? Will we affiliate a church whose spiritual leader is not an authorized trained clergy person and who places a Buddha next to the font during baptisms? Not one of these is a hypothetical situation. Every single one of the questions is one I have watched church leaders wrestle with. I have sat with the church as it engaged in open deliberation with every single one of these questions and many more besides. On what grounds, basis, or foundation are decisions like these made? Who has the right to speak for the whole when confronted with the questions like these? At one point, does it become clear that resolving any of these questions in either the affirmative or the negative creates a line of demarcation that some can cross and others cannot? When does a new divide emerge that substantively separates what has been from what will be? It is going to take a century or more, I am told, for this to shake out and for us to know whether or not something new is emerging. Only then will we know exactly what it is. Only then will we know exactly how it relates to what has been. Only then will we know what it has made. Only then will we know what it was that made the distinction necessary. In the meantime, the church is compelled to get very clear about what it believes. The church is compelled to distinguish between how much of what they currently believe is a byproduct of culture, gender orientation, etc. How much of what they currently believe cannot be sacrificed on the altar of change. I don't imagine there will be anything close to uniformity or unanimity in the resolution of these grand questions that the church is facing. There will be a multiplicity of voices vying for attention, claiming with varying degrees of veracity what is appropriate and what is not. Regardless, I can't imagine leadership in the church being relevant today without extending a call to all partners to engage in open dialogue about what matters most. I also can't imagine being a leader without speaking with some clarity about what matters most to me and why. The next subtitle is Perceiving, which brings us to the third calling of the church in this time, perceiving. Paul does remind us that we don't experience loss the same way as others do, who have no hope. Grief brings with it a real and often residual pain. We have come to know, however, that whatever weeping we do in the night is replaced by a joy that comes in the morning. As Jesus once said, let those who have eyes to see, see. This is about perception. Who among us has the vision to see beyond the time of grief, beyond the horizons of pain, to what lies on the other side? This is about perceiving. This is about seeing through the tears and the weight of our collective grief so that we not be overcome by a despair that blinds us to the hope that awaits. I believe it is time for the shamans among us to find their voice. I believe that it is time for the spiritual guides and directors to emerge with their poetry, their dance, their art, their music, their tongue, entice us to those places where the Spirit is living, breathing, and calling us to new embraces of wonder, imagination, creativity, and dare I say it, hope. There are among us, as there have always been throughout the life of the church, those who are especially sensitive to the movement and impulse of God's Holy Spirit. with a sensitivity that rational thought cannot explain or defend. These women and men experience profound insights that get communicated through poetry, art, dance, music, parable, narrative. They have always lived and walked among us, but they have not always been honored. Living through the time of the Enlightenment, which the Reformation Church did, we could not help but be influenced by a Western culture that came to rely almost exclusively on deductive reasoning, scientific proof, and deep intellect as tools used to test what is real and what is not. We put those tools to good use and in the process discovered much that had changed our way of thinking of living, of perceiving who we are and how we walk in this world. Western culture since the time of the Enlightenment has placed a high value on objective, rational, deductive reasoning. It calls upon independent bodies to serve without bias in the testing of and eventual establishment of what we accept as good, truthful, and enduring. It sees personal opinion, personal experience, personal thought, emotion, and temperament to be impediments to truth that must be avoided at all costs. The testing of postulated theorems must include an ability to demonstrate the lack of bias, emotion, and mere perception. Essential to this way of thinking and perceiving the world is the maintenance of a dichotomy between mind and body, flesh and spirit, material and spiritual. Those of us who have been raised to practice the spiritual arts have come to see the flesh as an impediment to our higher spiritual goals. It is that which makes us weak when we're face to face with temptation. Those who walk in the scientific world see the ineffable as an impediment to what the material world requires in the way of evidence. We can't let emotions like joy, anger, fear, hope, or anxiety impede our ability to analyze the data before us. Through all of this, the church has often failed to identify those who have been blessed with the charism of spiritual discernment. The church itself has not been immune from the tendency to reduce our truth to that which we can measure, test, subject to rational thought. It is not that we have lost the art of spiritual discernment and the truth that comes from inductive reasoning and intuition. We have simply more often than not disregarded it. It is time to call forth those who practice this art and whose gift is discernment. We need to invite them to find their voice. We need them to remind us that we too can see the world with new eyes. We need to ask them what they see so that our own perceptions are altered. We need to give them permission and latitude to express their vision in whatever artful language is the most acceptable to them. We need to develop our ability to intuit. We need to give ourselves permission at times to trust impulse and instinct against reason. We need to cultivate the ability to perceive that which is hidden to the rational mind. We need to let the subtle, the ineffable, and the mysterious remind us again of all that awe and wonder are able to do so. There is much more to see in front of us than a dying church. There is more to perceive in the diminishment of resources. There is more to experience than grief. It is not time just to hope against hope, but to discover what there is beyond the horizon of our grief that grounds us in hope. And that is about perception. In his book, The Prophetic Imagination, which I read more which I read more than 25 years ago, and so won't get this exactly right. Walter Brueggemann writes about the daring vision of the prophet. The prophet has an ability to imagine what others could not. When the kings were in power, and with that power started amassing a wealth that blinded them to the plight of the poor among them, it was the prophets who imagined a time of pending ruination that the kings could not see. Listen to Amos. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan who are on Mount Samaria. who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to their husbands, "Bring me something to drink." The Lord has surely sworn by the Lord's holiness. The time is surely coming upon you when they will take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks. That's from Amos chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. It was hard to believe that such a circumstance was possible. When the exiles were sent into the wilderness with nothing and were sure that God had abandoned them, the prophets imagined a day of reconciliation and hope they simply could not see. We hear this in the words of 2nd Isaiah. "Comfort, oh comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins." That's chapter 40, verses 1 and 2. Amos spoke to the wealthy who could not imagine anything, but that God would continue to reward them with wealth and power. Isaiah spoke to exiles who could not imagine that God would ever love or forgive them again. This is the prophetic imagination. This is about seeing with new eyes what God intends. This is about perception. Let those who have eyes to see, see. Let them speak the vision. Tell them to make it plain. Write the vision, make it plain on tablets so that a runner may read it. For there is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end. It does not lie. If it tarries, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. There is no denying that part of what is fueling our grief is the pace of change. We can't keep up. We are overwhelmed. What worked so well for us not that long ago isn't working anymore. Even those of us who are open to change aren't sure we can tolerate this much change. For those among us who can only see grief ahead, we listen for the voice of those with prophetic imagination. We invite them to share with us what it is they see in the future. We pray for the courage and the conviction to perceive with new eyes what lies beyond the horizon of our grief. This too shall pass. Perceiving does not arrive so that we can hide from our grief, but it does persist so that we do not face grief as others who have no hope. In the time of great change and tumultuous transformation, when the pain of loss and uncertainty are all too real, new perceptions will emerge and ground us in an abiding hope. Grieve, believe, perceive. I once heard Michael Kinnaman deliver a keynote address titled, "It's a Great Time to Be the Church." He was addressing everything that we are talking about here: diminishment, rapid and uncontrollable change, grief, abandonment by the youth and the young adults, etc. His ability to trust the movement of the Spirit and to see hope on the horizon has been a lingering source of inspiration to me. I agree with him. It is a great time to be the church. There is hard and painful work ahead. I have no doubt that in time, the church will look back on this moment and be grateful for those who have had the courage to change and those who had the courage to hold strong to their convictions. I have no doubt for some, both will be required. Grieving, believing, perceiving. 3 tasks to which the church is called in this time of dramatic change. These are not easy tasks, but these are also not easy times. It is not for the faint of heart. If you are a person of faith engaged in the life of the church today, you have undoubtedly already experienced some grief. You will be invited, either in the midst or in the aftermath of that grief, to see things with new eyes. You will also be encouraged to clarify what it is you are willing to accept with those new eyes and what you simply cannot. It is really a great time to be the church. So ends chapter 3.
Wow. Well, I think very beginning that you talked about the grieving process. I think a lot of us for GPC are there now, especially not just the pandemic and the new normal, but the normal of where are we right now? Who are we right now? With all of these questions, where are the youth? Where did the recollections of when the pews were full and the ministries were active and vibrant? Not that they aren't now, but they're different than people who have been in the church for 40, 50, 60 years. And they need to grieve that they feel like they've lost something, but they need to open their hearts to the future. And anyone who's grieved knows that there's several stages of grieving, and the end of the grieving cycle, really, I think it's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was the forefront of the 7 stages of grief.
Yes.
And when you get to the other side of the end of grieving, you're open to the new possibilities that this chapter talks about.
Yeah, as one who has had loss and one who is grieved, and I know that you've been through it too.
Absolutely.
There is abundance beyond that. I cannot imagine with the person still in my life ever having found after they departed would be there, but yet here it is. And it doesn't mean that you forget the old traditions, but you realize that there is so much more to be exposed to on the other side of that once you're involved in it. And it's important to hang on to that hope for what will be, and realize that at some point that there is a passing of something in some way, shape, or form. Change is always inevitable. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's easier than not, but it's always inevitable. And what's beyond that is really beautiful, but has to be given a chance too. So.
And I think like you're talking about the recollections and the memories, the reminiscing that happens. Those are all wonderful things because it puts us in our safety zone and our associations of when we felt good in those situations and those times. But I think the other piece of it is it should open us to, you can't regenerate those, right? You can't make them happen again because those people, those times, those events in culture are no longer now. And it's important for people to appreciate that the opening of your heart needs to be to the new normal. The new normal means this is where we are right now. And I think that was a terrific segue into appreciating the pastor, not just our current interim pastor, but the pastor, our future pastor or pastors, in terms of, we have to respect the position for which we're asking them or calling them to be, with the value of our finances, in that if you're really asking this person to give their heart, mind, soul, spirituality, all of it together to the church, we need to honor that and respect them enough to pay them the value of their skill set. And I just think this information in this book is so timely for GPC and so telling. As a governing board, we've gone through all of these questions many times in just the past 6 months with regard to all the information in these first 3 chapters. So I appreciate sharing this information with you, Lynn, and I hope other people are listening and ponder it and get some chat going about it, so that we can have a bigger conversation.
Absolutely. And to that point, I take it, Kim, you're free next Thursday night at 6:30 to do it again?
I am, but I'll be remote. Well, we're already remote, but I'll actually be in Georgia. But I will tune in by Zoom and just be somewhere else.
Great. Well, I'll get an invite going, and if you're interested in joining us, please send me your information and I will add you to the invitation and you can join the party.
Yep.
And thank you for joining us tonight if you've been with us, and do come back again next Thursday night. Kim, as always, I love you. Thanks for your partnership, honey.
Great job, reading. Great job.
Good night.
Have a
Have
good
a
night.
good one. Good night.
Bye.